All right, welcome to chapter 6.2 and a section from the option D. This is D4 on the heart and 6.2, the blood system. Okay, now we can't talk about the blood system without talking about how blood gets around in our bodies, okay? And these are going to be our blood vessels, arteries, veins, and capillaries. Let's talk arteries first. So arteries carry blood away from the heart. That's how I remember that. A for artery, A for away. They're always going to be carrying blood away from the heart. They also have an incredibly thick layer of muscle on the outside of them, and that's going to be able to keep the pressure pretty high in that artery and to help blood move through there. They're also going to have a pretty nice thick layer of these elastic collagen fibers on the outside to allow for it to expand and contract. And that's because this is a very high pressure blood vessel here. So let's go ahead and draw an artery. Okay, so an artery is going to have a fairly narrow opening called the lumen. And then on the outside, it is going to have a thick layer of muscle, and then also a layer of collagen. So on this outside, this is collagen. Okay, here we have a thick layer of muscle, and on the inside, a relatively narrow opening called the lumen. Okay, now veins are a little bit different, right? So veins are going to be carrying blood towards the heart, always, always, always. They have really thin walls, okay, a thin muscular layer, and that's because they're carrying blood at a low internal pressure. So they don't need that thick muscular wall to help compress the blood or push the blood or keep from popping, okay? These are at a low pressure, so those thin walls are A-okay. But they have something that arteries don't have, okay, and that is these valves, okay? So because your veins are carrying blood towards the heart, oftentimes they're carrying blood against the flow of gravity. And so we rely on muscle contractions here, okay, to kind of squeeze that blood upwards towards the heart. Well, if that muscle isn't actively contracting and it's not squeezing the blood, we want to make sure that the blood doesn't accidentally go back down to where it came from. So your veins have these things right here and right here called valves, and when your blood is kind of tempted to go back down to where it came from, these valves here stop that and prevent the backflow. So if we're looking at the difference between arteries and veins, okay, here's the artery we just drew: small lumen, thick muscular wall, thick layer of collagen. So let's draw our veins then. So our veins have a much wider lumen. I should note that this is a cross section of the vein, okay? If I took a slice here and then looked down on it, this is what I would be seeing. Okay, so a much thinner muscle wall and much thinner layer of collagen. So again, we kind of have the same components: collagen, muscle, lumen, just in much different proportions. Wider lumen, thinner muscles. Now, the last type of blood vessel we need to talk about, these capillaries. We're not going to draw them because they're ridiculously and utterly way too small, okay? They're only one cell thick. I don't even know how to begin to draw that. Apparently this person does, okay? But there's no way I could ever do that. So their wall is only one cell thick, and that's because this is where stuff is diffusing, okay, out of your blood vessels and into your tissues, or from your tissues into your blood, okay? And in order to do that, it has to cross the walls of the capillaries. So we want to make sure that those walls are nice and thin to make sure that this diffusion process happens a little bit easier. And like I said, these things are so super tiny, even their lumen here, the diameter of the blood vessel, is normally only thick enough for one of these red blood cells to pass through at a time. So much, much more small than these guys, okay? Here's our vein lumen, pretty wide. Here's our artery lumen, much more narrow, but these guys take the cake, really super small lumen. Okay, so in this chapter, we've got two basic sections, right? We've got our blood vessels, and then we've got the heart. So let's talk about this sucker, okay? This heart is made up of what we call cardiac muscle cells, okay? So it is first and foremost a muscle, but these muscle cells are a little bit special, okay? They have some weird properties that make them function super well for our heart tissue. So the first thing we're going to notice here is that the muscle cells, the cardiac muscle cells, are going to be multinucleated, okay? So they're going to have many nuclei. And so what this kind of turns that muscle cell into is almost like a whole bunch of cells fused together. This guy is a hard worker, pumping hundreds of thousands of times and just in a day, not stopping, okay? We got to make it easier. So let's have a bunch of field generals, okay, in these cells, a bunch of nuclei to make that easier. Okay, now in between the muscle cells, so here's one, here's another, in between them is something called an intercalated disc, and it's easy to remember, right? Of course it is. Inter means between, like interstate, a highway that runs between two states, okay? And then calcated, so we're talking calcium, and we know what a disc is. I hope you know what an opening is. If not, we have other problems, okay? So what that is this disc right here, and this disc has little holes in it. Oh, boo. Okay, this disc has little tiny holes in it that kind of allow stuff to go through, okay? So it makes it easier for the cytoplasm of two cells to kind of be exchanged, which is going to help messages go a little bit easier from one cell to the next. Okay, and the last thing that we should expect to find in these cardiac muscle cells is just a whole crap load of mitochondria. So your heart is a muscle and it is incessant. It is always beating. Some part of your heart is always in motion, and that takes a tremendous amount of energy. Okay, so we need a ton of ATP for all of those contractions. ATP is produced via the process of cellular respiration, and that of course happens most efficiently in the mitochondria. So here we're looking at a portion of a cardiac muscle cell. Here's the nucleus, that area. All of these things are mitochondria. Your muscle cells are just packed to the gills with these mitochondria. Here we can see the squiggly cristae. Okay, here they are, here they are. Okay, but I'm going to find a whole lot of them here in these cardiac muscle cells. Okay, so now we're going to draw a really simplified cross-section of the human heart. Okay, so as if I cut it in half. Okay, so I'm going to start where blood comes into the heart, right? So it comes in from a blood vessel into an atrium. That atrium leads into a ventricle. Okay, so something like this. All right, blood is going to leave that ventricle through a blood vessel. So let me show you what I've just drawn in case that was a total mind blower. I have just drawn half of the heart. Blood comes in here. It hangs out in the atrium for a second, goes down into a ventricle, and then leaves that ventricle through this blood vessel. It goes to an undisclosed location, which we'll talk about later, and then it needs to come back to the other side of the heart. Okay? So the other side of the heart also includes an atrium and a ventricle. Okay? So this ventricle also has a blood vessel that leaves. Okay? So something like this and like this. Okay, does yours look like mine? I don't know. I've had a ton of practice drawing these, so if yours is better than mine, bravo. Don't tell me about it. It'll hurt my feelings. And if not, okay, take a moment to really think about what kind of changes you need to make here. All right, so I'm gonna make a couple modifications as we're labeling here, all right? But I'm gonna start by labeling this blood vessel, holy crap, called the vena cava. Okay, this is where deoxygenated blood from the body is going to enter the heart. Okay, and then it's gonna come into this chamber called an atrium. Okay, now, is this the left or the right atrium? Well, when I'm looking at it, it's on my left, but the problem is that it's not all about me. So I don't want you to draw this next part, but what we're actually looking at here is a person. Here's their arms and legs and their abnormally large heart, okay? So there's a person. So this is actually their right and their left hand. Here they are. They're very happy about this shape I've given them, okay? So it's not about you, it's about the person, okay? And this side is their right side. So we're gonna label this as their right atrium, okay? So from the atrium, the blood flows into the right ventricle, okay? And separating the right atrium and the right ventricle is a set of valves. And it's important that you draw these going the right way. So these valves point inwards, okay, that way. And these are called atrioventricular valves. All one word. So if you have room to fit it, awesome. If you're dumb like me and you didn't leave enough space, well, then this is what you get, okay? So this is what we call an atrioventricular valve. We'll talk more about that function in a little bit. Okay, so we go from the vena cava into the right atrium, through the atrioventricular valve, into the right ventricle. Then blood is going to flow through this blood vessel here. It's going to go this way. And this blood vessel is called the pulmonary artery. Okay, artery because it's carrying blood away from the heart. Okay, pulmonary means lungs. So here the heart is going to pump blood through the pulmonary artery into the lungs. To get into the pulmonary artery, there's another set of valves, and they look like this. Okay, they're shaped like half moons, okay, and they point that way so that you can easily see that they would open if blood is pushing them this way, but they would shut if blood was trying to come back this way. And these are called semilunar valves. Okay, semi meaning half, lunar meaning moon. They're shaped like a half moon, so they're curved a little bit. Okay, now what I'm not kind of doing a great job here is showing you what the ventricle actually looks like, right? So all of this, all the structure here, other than the valves, is made up of muscle. And the muscle of the right ventricle is remarkably thicker than the right atrium. So I'm going to kind of shade that in a little bit to show that the muscle layer is thicker in the ventricle than in the atrium. So blood is going to go this way. It's going to go through the pulmonary arteries to the lungs, do some really cool things like pick up oxygen, and then it needs to come back to the heart. It's going to come back to the heart through this blood vessel called the pulmonary vein because it's going towards the heart. From the pulmonary vein, it's going to travel into the left atrium. It's going to go through another set of atrioventricular valves. Okay, it's going to flow into the left ventricle. Okay, from the left ventricle, it's going to flow past another set of semilunar valves. So notice how they kind of need to be more of a curved shape. I'm having some trouble with that, okay? And again, make sure that they're pointing in such a way so that you can see how they would open up if blood was flowing this way. All right, so again, these are semilunar valves. Okay, and then the blood is going to be pumped from the left ventricle into this blood vessel, which is going to take it to the rest of the body. Okay, and this blood vessel is called the aorta. Okay, now I've got all of my pieces and parts labeled. Okay, I know that ventricles have a thicker wall than atria. Okay, so I'm going to shade that in a little bit. Okay, but since this left ventricle is pumping blood to the rest of the body, see, this ventricle is only pumping it to the lungs. That's not so far. This ventricle has to pump it to the whole rest of the body. That's going to need a massive contraction to get that to happen. So for that, we're going to need a super thick ventricular wall. Okay, and this is how you get full marks for drawing an IB heart. Okay, so again, making sure we have things labeled, our valves are pointing in the right directions. Okay, our walls of our ventricles are thicker than our atria, and the left is thicker than the right. And there you have it. Okay, so let's talk about how the blood is actually going to flow through the heart, in what sequence, what's happening here. So I'm going to be bringing in deoxygenated blood from the rest of the body in through the vena cava. It's going to flow through the vena cava in here to the right atrium. It's going to flow past this right atrioventricular valve and into the right ventricle. The right ventricle is going to squeeze it past these semilunar valves, so that's what they actually look like, okay? And then through this pulmonary artery. Okay, from this pulmonary artery, it is going to head to the lungs, okay? So it's going to get rid of a bunch of waste like carbon dioxide, it's going to pick up oxygen, okay? And all of that happens at the lungs. So after it leaves the lungs, it's no longer deoxygenated, it's oxygenated blood, okay? And it's going to flow in here through this pulmonary vein, okay? So veins carry things back to the heart, okay? And it's going to enter this left atrium, flow past this left atrioventricular valve into the left ventricle. The semilunar valves are right there. They're just kind of hard to see, but I promise they're there. It's going to flow past those semilunar valves into the aorta, and from the aorta, it's going to go to the rest of the body. Okay, so now when I say the rest of the body, okay, what that means is that it's got to go through a series of blood vessels, okay, to kind of get to the tissue where it needs to go. So we're going to be starting here in the heart, okay, and I'm going to flow through the aorta, which is a really large artery, and then that large artery is going to branch into several smaller arteries. Those smaller arteries are going to branch into really small arteries called arterioles. And we're going to hear that ending in a lot of spots that means small. Okay, so arterioles. That oxygenated blood is going to flow into those really teeny tiny capillaries where they're going to diffuse oxygen, nutrients, etc. Into the cells, and waste is going to diffuse back into them. Okay, so now they are deoxygenated and full of things that we need to get rid of. Okay, so from those capillaries are going to join together to make teeny tiny little veins called venules. Those venules are going to join together to make larger veins, and then those veins join together to flow into the largest vein, which is the vena cava. The vena cava is going to enter into the heart. It's eventually going to get pumped through this pulmonary artery. It's going to go to the lungs. Gas exchange is going to occur in the alveoli of the lungs, and then we come back to where we started. Okay, so a little while ago when we were drawing our hearts, and I'm sure it looked just like this, we made note of the fact that the ventricle walls are thicker than the atria, okay? But the left ventricle has a much thicker wall than the right, okay? And again, this ventricle is only pumping blood, I say only, but it's only pumping blood to the lungs. It doesn't have very far to go. This ventricle, the left one, has to pump blood through the aorta to the entire reaches of your body, okay? So if your heart is here, it's got to pump blood all the way to the extremities of your body, and that requires a pretty gnarly, strong muscle contraction, which is why we need those super thick walls. Okay, so you may have already picked up on the fact that by the time oxygenated blood makes it to any tissue in the body, it's gone through the heart twice, okay? And so this is why we call the heart a double pump, all right? So it goes into the heart once, which is going to pump it into the lungs. Then it's going to go back to the heart, where it's then pumped to the rest of the body. Okay, so it's got two complete circuits. Let me get rid of my crazy scribbly nonsense so that you can pretend to see this. Okay, so two complete circuits, one that goes through the lungs, okay, and one to the rest of the body. Okay, so by now we know that blood only reaches the far extremities of your body via these amazing incessant contractions, okay? Your heart is an incredible piece of machinery. And so when we say cardiac cycle, what we're really talking about is a heartbeat, right? And we have about 72 cardiac cycles or heartbeats per minute. That means more than one per second for your entire life. These contractions, okay, come in periods called diastoles and systoles. Okay, so I remember diastole by thinking about dilation. Helps if I spell that right, okay? So I hear this word dilation when we talk about cervixes dilating during childbirth. So the cervix is a normally narrow opening. During childbirth, that opening gets bigger and bigger and bigger until it's large enough for the baby to pass through the birth canal. Okay, so I think of that as like being like relaxed, right? A diastole is when a chamber is relaxed. Okay, and so you can imagine if something is relaxing, it's going from being all tense, okay, and squeezed up to being like more open and relaxed. So that's going to cause a decrease in pressure. And if it's decreasing in pressure, blood is going to be able to flow into that chamber. So when something is in diastole, it's relaxed, blood is flowing into it. During a systole, this is a contraction, okay? So if something is going from being relaxed to contracting, that's going to increase the pressure in there, and it is forcing blood out. Your heart has such an ingenious design that we want to make sure that blood is flowing the way that it's supposed to, okay? And that job is done by these valves that we've been labeling. So these valves are like a one-way door. Now, when a chamber is in diastole, like this one here, okay, blood is going to be allowed to enter that chamber and kind of push past these two valves right here. Okay, that's because they open this way. All right. Now, when that same chamber is in systole and it's squeezing blood out, what's going to happen is some of that blood is going to squeeze up against those valves and cause them to shut. Okay, so what it does is it prevents blood from moving backwards through the loop. We don't want that. Okay, and those valves are just little one-way doors that help make sure that that doesn't happen. Okay, so if you ever have the opportunity to listen to someone's heartbeat, you're going to notice that it doesn't sound like bah, bah, bah. Okay, it sounds what we call like a lub-dub, which is doo-doom, doo-doom, doo-doom. And what we're hearing when we hear that sound is actually the sound of these valves slamming shut. Okay, so we can imagine that when this ventricle squeezes, it's going to cause these valves to slam shut. And we're going to actually be able to hear that. So when we hear these valves slam shut at different times, okay, then we're going to be hearing what's called that lub-dub sound. Okay, so what's really cool about your heartbeat is that it contracts and relaxes without any control from the nervous system. It doesn't need your brain to constantly send a message telling it to do its job. It's what we call myogenic, okay? So myo meaning muscle, okay? And I think of genic like genesis, okay, to start or begin something. So it's kind of like a muscle contraction that starts itself. Now, even though the heart is responsible for its own contraction and relaxation, okay, it does still have to be controlled, and it does that with some specialized tissue called nodes. And we have two of them that we need to pay special attention to. The first one is called the sinoatrial node, or the SA node for short. You may also hear it referred to as the pacemaker, because it literally acts like a pacemaker for the heart. So it's right here, okay, in the right atrium, and it has these little fibers that run into each of the atria. So when the SA node fires, it causes both atria to contract. The AV node, or atrioventricular node, is also located in the right atrium, okay, but its job is to make the ventricles contract. So here's how I remember that. Okay, the SA node comes first and it causes the atria to contract. The AV node comes second and causes the ventricles to contract. Okay, so I'll do the drawing with you in just a second, but just to kind of give you some idea of what's going on here in this picture. The SA node is going to fire, and it's going to send a signal to the atria, telling the atria to contract. It's also going to send a signal to the AV node, and the AV node is going to send a signal down here to the ventricles, causing the ventricles to contract. So what that means is that the two atria are going to contract at the same time because they're both getting the same message. And then the two ventricles are going to contract at the same time because they're getting the message at the same time, but they're going to be slightly behind the atria. So let's go ahead and draw this. I'm just going to do a very, very simple drawing of the heart. Yeah, I wasn't kidding, okay? So the SA node is here, again, also known as the pacemaker, and it has fibers that cause the atria to contract when it fires. The AV node is also located in the right atrium, okay? And so maybe I should draw these a little thicker so we can tell my labeling lines versus my drawing lines. So SA node, okay, and then the fibers that connect to it. There are also fibers that connect to the AV node. The AV node sends messages to the ventricles along a series of fibers to make the ventricles contract. And that signal is sent along a group of fibers called the Perkinje fibers. Okay, so here we are from SA node to the atria, SA node to the AV node along the Perkinje fibers to make these ventricles contract. Okay, so it's worth noting that they're on a slight delay. There's about 1/10 of a second delay between when the atria and the ventricles are going to contract, and that's why we hear that lub-dub sound. Okay, those things are contracting and closing their valves at different times. Now, your brain doesn't control your regular heartbeat, but it can increase your heart rate in times of need, okay? So the way that works, it usually starts with some kind of a carbon dioxide accumulation. So remember, we're making carbon dioxide when we are doing a lot of cellular respiration, so maybe something like during exercise, okay? And that accumulates in the blood. So our brain can actually sense those increased carbon dioxide levels because what the carbon dioxide does is it lowers the pH, okay? It creates an acid when dissolved in solution. And so the medulla oblongata is part of our brain that can sense those changes. So the medulla oblongata is going to send a message to the SA node telling it to hurry the heck up. Okay, so it's going to increase the heart rate. Once those carbon dioxide levels return to normal, it sends another message to the SA node saying, okay, well, go back to doing your regular business and I'll leave you alone. Okay, so in times of increased carbon dioxide levels, okay, our medulla oblongata can kind of kick in and increase that heart rate. And the whole function is to be pumping more blood to the lungs to get rid of that carbon dioxide and pick up oxygen. So we want to be able to do that faster. So I mentioned exercise. Okay, let's make sure we understand what's going on there. When you exercise, your muscles need a lot of ATP. In order to get ATP, you got to do cell respiration. When you do cellular respiration, you're producing carbon dioxide. Okay, so just in case you've forgotten, having a major brain problem, okay, cellular respiration produces carbon dioxide. So the more of it I do, the more CO2 I produce. All right, so again, that medulla oblongata can sense those increased CO2 levels, and it makes the heart beat faster so that it can send more of this deoxygenated blood to the lungs to pick up oxygen and come back in to the heart. Now, exercise isn't the only thing that can raise the heart rate, okay? There's some other things, including adrenaline. Now, the fancy pants word for adrenaline is epinephrine. Like some of you use EpiPens, that's what's in there. Okay, and epinephrine or adrenaline is made by the adrenal glands, which sit right on top of your kidneys. So in times of stress or excitement, okay, those adrenal glands can produce epinephrine, which then tells the SA node to pick up the pace on your heart rate. It starts initiating that fight or flight reflex and getting your heartbeat ready for some exercise because it thinks that something crazy and wild is about to happen. Okay, now in a minute we're going to be looking at some graphical representations of the cardiac cycle. I just want to make sure that we're clear on how that works. Okay, so again, we've got our SA node, okay, our pacemaker sends messages to the atria. It also sends a message to the AV node, which sends a message along these Perkinje fibers, okay? So these Perkinje fibers extend down into the wall of the ventricles, and it causes the ventricles to contract. So when I say them, I'm talking about the ventricles. Okay, so many of you have seen a readout like this before. Well, let's be honest, if you haven't seen this and you haven't watched TV in I don't know, ever, and that's wonderful and sad at the same time. Anyways, this is called an ECG, or electrocardiogram, okay, ECG. And the ECG is actually measuring electrical activity. Okay, so over here on the y-axis, I know that's a scary word, okay, this is all a measure of electrical activity, and it's picking up on the electrical activity that we're getting from the SA and AV nodes over the course of a period of time. So one of the things that you need to be able to do is to annotate what's going on at each point here. All right, now this first little hump here is called the P wave. You can find it by looking for the big peak, and it's the hump right before it. And the P wave is kind of signaling when that SA node is firing. So right here, this is the signal that the SA node is firing, and we know that when the SA node fires, that causes the atria to contract. So I'm seeing P waves here. Here's another one. This is probably another one. Right after the P wave is a little dip here in electrical activity called point Q. Point Q is signaling the AV node to fire, okay? So up here at the P wave, we have SA node firing. This is where the AV node is firing, so all these little dips there. And that leads into the QRS complex. So we just labeled point Q. Here's point R. Here's point S. The QRS complex. QRS. Okay, and the QRS complex involves the signal traveling through the Perkinje fibers, okay, and then causing the ventricles to contract. So we already know that the ventricular contraction is much more powerful, and so that makes sense to me, right? If the atrial contraction is kind of wimpy, okay, the ventricular contraction is much more powerful. So you may have noticed, okay, we started with a P wave, and then Q, R, S. These go in alphabetical order in case you haven't put that together. And what comes after P, Q, R, S? Well, that would be T. So the humps after the QRS complex are the T waves. Okay, so Q, R, S, T. And during the T wave, everything is just getting repolarized. So we're attempting to return to our what we call resting potential, okay? We are repolarizing and just getting ready for the next cardiac cycle. So a cardiac cycle includes atrial contraction, ventricular contraction, and then getting back to normal. Atrial contraction, ventricular contraction, getting back to normal. So here is one cardiac cycle. We have on this graph 1, 2 cardiac cycles. So who gives a holy moly? Well, we can use ECGs to diagnose a bunch of problems. So your normal heartbeat is going to look like this, okay? They're spaced at appropriate intervals, okay? And they're evenly spaced. A fast heartbeat would look like this, so less time in between each cardiac cycle. Same thing with a slow heartbeat, except for here we have more time between cardiac cycles. For those of you who have what we call irregular heartbeats, okay, this is when we don't have the same amount of time between heartbeats, so it's not a consistent interval there between cardiac cycles. And of course, if your ECG looks like this, that's bad, you're dead. You should probably get someone to look into that. Okay, now all of these cardiac cycles revolve around your heart going through periods of systole and diastole, or relaxations and contractions. So when a chamber is in diastole, it's relaxed. The pressure's low. So because the pressure is low, blood is filling that chamber. When it squeezes or becomes in a state of systole, okay, it's squeezing, contracting, becoming smaller. That's going to increase the pressure and force blood out of that chamber. Okay, so now that we know how the heart should be working, let's talk about what happens when we don't take care of our heart, okay, and some pretty nasty things start to happen. The first one we want to go over is called Atherosclerosis, okay, and this is a slow buildup of plaque in arteries, okay, so plaque is made up of lipids, cholesterol, calcium. It's a bunch of crap, and it can build up in your arteries. And so when that happens, okay, we can see the side view of an artery here. It's building up, and what's happening is it's making the lumen of this artery smaller and smaller and smaller. Now, we still have the same blood volume, but now all that blood has to pass through a teeny tiny hole. Okay, that's a problem. Especially if it blocks one of your coronary arteries. So I know you've seen this picture before, right? So, well, if you haven't, this is a heart, okay? And always on a heart, we see these blood vessels running along the outside of it. Don't forget, the heart is a muscle. It needs its own supply of oxygenated blood. It needs a lot of oxygen, a lot of glucose. It's a muscle. It's got to work. So we have these special arteries running and servicing just the heart muscle, like an exclusive cocktail waitress, okay? And if those arteries become blocked with plaque, blood will no longer be able to travel through those coronary arteries. That means a section of heart isn't getting the oxygenated blood it needs, and it starts to freak out. And this is what we call a myocardial infarction or heart attack. Now, the workings of the heart weren't always well understood. So way back in the day, like even before I was born, okay, people thought that blood was produced in the heart and then used up by the tissues of the body. And I can see how they would think that, right? It looks like it's coming from the heart. If you don't have a heart, it's kind of bad, okay? So they thought it was being used up by the organs. And so what they would do is if a person had a disease, they would just try to take some of that blood out using leeches, okay? It's called bloodletting, so that they thought that if they took out this diseased blood, that the heart would then make new, better, happier blood, okay, and it would go to the organs. Well, it doesn't work like that, okay? We now know that the blood makes a circuit through the body, and it does all kinds of crazy things and goes to lungs and whatever, but in the end of the day, it comes back to the heart. Okay, how did we figure that out? Well, I keep saying we. I didn't do any of this. I'm sure I don't have to tell you that. That was discovered by one of the great anatomists named William Harvey. And so what he did is a bunch of live dissections where he tied off blood vessels and studied the flow and the circulation. And he figured out that the heart is a double pump, that blood doesn't get used up, okay? That the heart pumps it to the lungs, and then it pumps it to the rest of the body. I don't know what this drawing is supposed to be. This is body. These are lungs. Good luck to you. I hope that you're not hard of hearing and that you can listen instead of just seeing this crazy nonsense. Okay, so William Harvey, important to know, okay, studied circulation and the double pump. So what if my pump isn't working? What if my heart decides to go on strike, right? It's not beating correctly. Well, one of the things that we can do is we can install a pacemaker. So you may remember that the pacemaker is another name for the SA node, and we can actually install an artificial pacemaker that has these little electrical leads that go into that SA node tissue. And so we can basically replace an SA node, like a real one in your heart that isn't working correctly, with a fake one, and it's pre-programmed to tell your heart to beat, like keep going, keep going, keep going. Okay, now what if your heart works normally on a regular basis, but you have a buildup of plaque in those coronary arteries and you're having a heart attack? Well, you're likely to see these shocker panel things called defibrillators. And what these defibrillators do is they shock the heart back into its normal rhythm by resetting those electrical signals. So remember our ECG, okay, looking like, well, that's really bad, but it looks something like that, okay? Those defibrillators can shock your heart back into that normal rhythm. One of the other common problems we see in our cardiovascular system is something called a thrombosis. Okay, so we got to be careful when we're sitting down for long periods of time, like on long airplane flights or car rides, because when blood stops moving, when it stops flowing, it has the tendency to form blood clots. Okay, now this isn't a problem in our arteries, right? Because our arteries have that thick wall, they're under high pressure, so the blood is always moving. But remember, we rely on muscles to contract and squeeze blood through the veins. So if you're sitting really still for a long period of time and that blood isn't moving but it's allowed to sit, it can form a clot. And then if part of that clot travels to, let's say, your brain, it can clog some of the blood vessels that send oxygenated blood to your brain, and then that brain tissue starts to freak out and die because it doesn't have oxygen, and that's what we call a stroke. So we have to be really careful about those things. Okay, and the last problem with the circulatory system that we're going to go through is something called hypertension. So hyper meaning above, okay, and tension referring to a pressure or a force. So this is higher than normal blood pressure. Blood pressure is a good thing. If your blood pressure is 0, you're probably dead, okay? Well, you're not probably dead, you're just dead, okay? We should be getting a normal amount of pressure on the inside of those artery walls. Remember, those arteries have to maintain a pressure so that they can squeeze the blood all the way to the extremities of your body, okay? Unfortunately, this pressure can become way too much, just an extensive amount of pressure, and that usually happens when we have the buildup of plaque. So if I have plaque buildup, I have the same volume of blood now trying to squeeze through a tinier opening, and what that's going to do is increase the pressure on the sides of these arteries. No good. So how do we measure blood pressure? Well, we usually use a blood pressure monitor. This is a digital one. There are analog ones, and it's going to give us 2 numbers. Both numbers are measured in this really old school unit, okay, mmHg. Mm like millimeters, Hg standing for mercury. So they literally used to measure how many millimeters mercury would be able to travel upwards through a tube. And of course, the more pressure you have, the higher that mercury would be able to travel. Okay, so we still use those units. I don't know why, but that's okay. And we're always going to get 2 blood pressure measurements, okay? The top number is the systolic blood pressure, okay? So that's the pressure when your ventricles are contracting, okay? So we're getting a squeeze. That's why it's higher, okay? Because it's a lot of pressure going on in there when that ventricle is squeezing a lot of blood through there. And then we've got our diastolic blood pressure. It's the number on the bottom, and it should be a smaller number because that's the pressure when our ventricles are in diastole. They're relaxed. They're not actively pushing blood through those arteries. So to determine whether someone has hypertension or if their blood pressure is normal, we usually take a look at the systolic number, okay, and we can reference a chart like this. So we really want our systolic blood pressure to be less than 120. Okay, so this person here that's at a 135, okay, they're falling into this pre-hypertension category. That means they're almost like in Problemville. Okay, so if we're thinking about recommendations, Okay, we obviously want to recommend losing weight. Okay, less weight means less blood volume that you need, which means less pressure on the arteries. Okay, changing our diet to decrease the likelihood of the buildup of plaque, etc. Okay, so at this point, you're like ready to be a doctor. I trust you, right? You should be able to interpret blood pressures and make recommendations to those people. And that'll do it for chapter 6.2 and D4 on the transport system.